What if a single mission had altered the course of World War II? In late 1943, as the leaders of the Allied powers gathered in Tehran for their first face-to-face meeting to plan the defeat of Nazi Germany, a desperate Adolf Hitler in Berlin deployed his most ruthless commando to carry out a mission of unthinkable audacity: the simultaneous assassination of Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in one devastating strike. This is the story of Operation Long Jump, Hitler's plot to decapitate the Allied leadership with a single, lethal blow. By late 1943, the tide of World War II was slowly turning against Nazi Germany. The Red Army had halted the German advance at Stalingrad and began pushing westward. Allied forces had seized Sicily and were fighting their way up the Italian peninsula. Meanwhile, American industrial might was shipping massive quantities of war materials to Britain and the Soviet Union. For the first time since the war began, the Big Three Allied leaders, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, planned to meet face-to-face to coordinate military strategy and discuss the post-war world. Tehran, the capital of Iran, was selected as the meeting location, a compromise that required Roosevelt and Churchill to travel thousands of miles into Stalin's sphere of influence. The city was under joint Soviet-British occupation, with both nations having invaded neutral Iran in 1941 to secure vital supply routes to the USSR. The Soviet embassy compound would host the meetings, with Roosevelt staying in a guest house on the grounds while Churchill resided at the nearby British embassy. The American embassy stood a mile away across the busy city, a security nightmare given Roosevelt's physical limitations from polio. Enter SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's go-to man for impossible missions and one of the war's most fascinating figures. Standing at 6'4", with a prominent dueling scar across his left cheek, Skorzeny had established himself as Nazi Germany's premier commando just 2 months earlier through an audacious mission that had stunned the world. In September 1943, after Italy's new government surrendered to the Allies, Hitler had tasked Skorzeny with rescuing deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, who was being held prisoner at a remote mountaintop hotel accessible only by cable car. Skorzeny led a daring glider assault on Gran Sasso, landing directly on the mountaintop with minimal casualties. He freed Mussolini without firing a shot and evacuated him via a small aircraft from the perilously short mountain plateau. The operation made headlines worldwide and cemented Skorzeny's reputation as a master of unconventional warfare. Hitler, impressed by this success, rewarded Skorzeny with promotion, the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, and a growing role in special operations. When Nazi intelligence discovered the planned Tehran conference, Skorzeny became the natural choice to lead what would be the most ambitious assassination plot of the war. According to Soviet accounts, in mid-October 1943, German military intelligence intercepted an encrypted U.S. Navy transmission that revealed the date and location of the upcoming Big Three meeting. The information reached Hitler's desk within days. For the increasingly desperate Führer, this represented an extraordinary opportunity. If all three Allied leaders could be eliminated simultaneously, it might create enough chaos to fracture the alliance and buy Germany precious time to develop new wonder weapons or negotiate a separate peace. Hitler approved the plan, codenamed Operation Long Jump, Unternehmen Weitsprung, and placed Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the imposing 6'7" chief of the Reich Security Main Office, in charge. Kaltenbrunner, who had replaced Reinhard Heydrich after his assassination, collaborated with Walter Schellenberg, head of the SD Foreign Intelligence Service, to develop the specifics. The operation would deploy in phases. First, advance teams would infiltrate Tehran to establish safe houses and communications. Then, the main assault force led by Skorzeny would parachute in, assassinate the Allied leaders, and potentially capture Roosevelt alive to use as leverage in negotiations with the Americans. The Germans had significant advantages: a network of sympathizers in Iran, which had strong pro-German leanings despite its official neutrality, rugged terrain surrounding Tehran that was perfect for covert infiltration, and the element of surprise. What Hitler didn't account for was the extraordinary Soviet intelligence network operating behind German lines. In particular, one Soviet operative would play a crucial role in foiling the plot before it could begin. Nikolai Kuznetsov was one of the USSR's most talented spies, a master of disguise who spoke flawless German with no trace of a Russian accent. Operating behind enemy lines in Nazi-occupied Ukraine, Under the identity of Oberleutnant Paul Siebert, Kuznetsov had infiltrated German military circles. In early November 1943, while drinking with SS Sturmbannführer Ulrich von Ortel, Kuznetsov struck intelligence gold. The intoxicated German officer boasted about an upcoming operation targeting the Allied leaders at their Tehran meeting. "We will eliminate Stalin and Churchill and turn the tide of the war. We will abduct Roosevelt to help our Führer to come to terms with America," Ortel reportedly told Kuznetsov. Ortel revealed critical details. Commandos were training in Copenhagen, multiple teams would be involved, and none other than the famous Otto Skorzeny would lead the mission. Kuznetsov promptly relayed this bombshell intelligence to Moscow through partisan radio operators. With Moscow alerted, a young Soviet intelligence officer in Tehran named Gevorg Vartanian was activated. Just 19 years old in 1943, Vartanian led a team of 7 Soviet operatives who had been monitoring German activities in Iran. Our group was the first to locate the Nazi landing party, 6 radio operators, near the town of Qum, 60 kilometers from Tehran. We followed them to Tehran, where the Nazi field station had readied a villa for their stay. They were traveling by camel and were loaded with weapons, Vartanian later recalled. The German advance team established themselves in Tehran, setting up radio equipment and disguising themselves by dyeing their hair and adopting local clothing. Unbeknownst to them, Vartanian's team monitored their every move and intercepted their transmissions back to Berlin. Vartanian said, "When we decrypted these radio messages, we learned that the Germans were preparing to land a second group of subversives for a terrorist act, the assassination or abduction of the Big Three. The second group was supposed to be led by Skorzeny himself, who had already visited Tehran to study the situation on the spot." The Soviet team had a crucial decision to make: arrest the German advance team immediately or continue surveillance to gather more intelligence. They chose the latter, knowing that premature action might warn Berlin while revealing little about the main assault force. As President Roosevelt's plane touched down in Tehran on November 27, 1943, the assassination plot was still very much active. Unaware of the specific threat, American security was nonetheless concerned about the president's vulnerability during his mile-long commutes between the American embassy and the Soviet compound where the meetings would occur. Soviet General Dmitry Arkadyev, head of the NKVD Transportation Department in Iran, approached Mike Riley, Roosevelt's chief of Secret Service detail, with alarming news. Nazi operatives were in Tehran with plans to assassinate the Allied leaders. Ambassador Averell Harriman then briefed the president on the plot. While some American and British officials were skeptical, wondering if this was merely a Soviet ploy, the risk was deemed too great to ignore. Stalin offered a solution. Roosevelt should stay in the Soviet embassy compound, eliminating the dangerous daily commute across Tehran. After initial hesitation, FDR agreed to the arrangement, unaware that his quarters in the Soviet embassy were thoroughly bugged with listening devices. Churchill, whose British embassy was adjacent to the Soviet compound, maintained his original lodging arrangements. The 3 leaders were now gathered within a heavily secured perimeter, with thousands of Soviet NKVD troops swarming the city. With the Allied leaders now in Tehran, Vartanian's team moved against the German radio operators. "We arrested all the members of the first group and forced them to make contact with enemy intelligence under our supervision," he later revealed. Under duress, the captured Germans sent coded messages to Berlin that allowed Soviet intelligence to monitor the communications regarding the main assault. With the situation turning increasingly unfavorable and fearing a trap, Berlin reportedly instructed Skorzeny to abort the mission. Vartanian said, "It was tempting to seize Skorzeny himself, but the Big Three had already arrived in Tehran, and we could not afford the risk. We deliberately gave a radio operator an opportunity to report the failure of the mission, and the Germans decided against sending the main group under Skorzeny to Tehran. The ambitious Nazi plot had been neutralized before the main assault could begin." While Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin conducted their momentous meetings discussing the invasion of France and the post-war world, they remained largely unaware of how close they had come to assassination. In the decades following World War II, Operation Long Jump has remained shrouded in controversy. Soviet accounts emphasize the brilliance of their intelligence work in foiling the plot, while some Western historians question whether a concrete assassination plan ever existed beyond the planning stages. Otto Skorzeny himself denied the operation's existence after the war. In his memoirs, he claimed he had advised Hitler that such a mission was unfeasible and that the Führer had agreed with his assessment. Long jump has really only existed in the imagination of a bunch of less than truth-loving hacks, Scorsese wrote dismissively. Some historians have suggested that Stalin may have exaggerated or even fabricated the plot to ensure Roosevelt would stay in the Soviet embassy, where his conversations could be monitored. Yet several pieces of evidence lend credibility to the plot's existence. German documents confirm that Hitler's desperation was growing by late 1943. Scorsese had demonstrated the capability for such audacious missions with the Mussolini rescue. Roosevelt himself mentioned the plot in his papers. British diplomat Alexander Cadogan recorded receiving information about a German assassination plan. Whether or not Operation Long Jump was as developed as Soviet accounts claim, its failure, real or hypothetical, preserved the Allied leadership at a pivotal moment in World War II. The Tehran Conference produced critical decisions that shaped the remainder of the war. Agreement on Operation Overlord, the cross-channel invasion into northern France scheduled for May 1944. Coordination of Soviet offensives with the Western Allied landings. Stalin's commitment to enter the war against Japan following Germany's defeat. Preliminary discussions on post-war borders and the United Nations. Had even one of the Allied leaders been assassinated, these agreements might have been delayed or abandoned entirely. The strategic consequence would have been enormous, potentially prolonging the war by many months or even years. The operation also demonstrates Hitler's increasing desperation and willingness to gamble on high-risk operations as Germany's strategic position deteriorated. By late 1943, conventional military victory was slipping beyond reach, pushing the Nazi leadership toward increasingly audacious schemes and wonder weapons. For the Soviet intelligence services, particularly the young operatives like Gevorg Vartanian, foiling the plot became a point of immense pride. Vartanian was awarded the Gold Star Medal of the Hero of the Soviet Union in 1984 for his role in uncovering Operation Long Jump and his subsequent Cold War service. The Nazi plot to kill the Allied leaders in Tehran remains one of World War II's most fascinating might-have-beens, a desperate gamble that, if successful, could have dramatically altered the course of history. Instead, the Big Three survived to lead their nations to victory, meeting twice more at Yalta and Potsdam as they shaped the post-war world. If you enjoyed the video, please like it, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to History Scroll for more content like this.